took a while. Well, I saw that.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, no, I liked it better.
Yeah, it's good.
Can you hear me?
Nobody's listening. They can hear you. They just turn to two different things.
I'm speaking to you, Jerry Cohn. Can you hear me? I'm talking to you, Jerry Cohn. Can you hear me? Hi, welcome to the summer 2014 meeting of the National Superintendent's Roundtable. I'm delighted that you're all here. For those of you that I haven't met yet, I'm James Harvey. I'm the Executive Director of the Roundtable. Since the camera crew can't see you, I'd like to thank you for that standing ovation. We have a wonderful program this weekend, I think, with some very impressive speakers on a topic that couldn't be more timely. It does seem to be in the last 12 months. The nature of the conversation about what's going on in American life has changed, and that suddenly the divide in terms of income has become prominent again. People are starting to talk about children's poverty. We're seeing stories about it in USA Today and in Time magazine. We're seeing reports about homeless children on CBS News. And I think a lot of that actually is due to the work of our speaker this evening, Kent McGuire, the president of the Southern Education Foundation, whose organization produced just a remarkable report in 2013 called The New Majority. And it pointed out a stunning figure that I think Kent is going to be talking about this evening, namely that almost 1/2 of the students in public schools in the United States are low income, and that includes some half-dozen states in the South in which over 60% of the students in public schools are low income. And this is an important fact that somehow seems to have escaped the notice of many of the people commenting on education in the United States, and I think it's time to bring that into the discussion. Kent is an old-time, long-time friend of the National Superintendent's Roundtable. Many of us remember his fabulous commentary to us in 2009 when we were in Philadelphia and he was Dean of the College of Education at Temple University. I first met him when the Clinton administration was giving way to the Bush administration, and Kent was Assistant Secretary for Education for Research and Improvement, and he wanted to leave behind him a legacy for the incoming Bush administration on what should be done in educational research, and I was hired to help him produce that, and we produced a wonderful memo for the Bush administration. There is no evidence anywhere that anyone at any time ever looked at a single word of that memo. But Kent then went on to become Dean of the School of Education at Temple University. He is now president of the Southern Education Foundation. I often thought he really would have had a remarkable career if only he had run into me earlier, but we have done what we can to move him along. So, what's most important, however, about tonight's introduction is not only that Kent has had this fabulous career and has done this wonderful work in putting children's poverty on the national agenda, because I give the Southern Education Foundation a lot of credit for that. I also want to point out that without Kent, we would not be going to hear Willie Nelson tomorrow night. I think we should give him a big round of applause. So with that, our friend and colleague, Kent McGuire.
I had forgotten some of that. You're right, no one paid any attention to us. I should have gotten to you years ahead of time. My wife probably really thinks that I should have done that. Well, thank you for having me here. I don't know whether or not our new majority report has had the effect that we actually want it to have in terms of changing the nature of the discourse in this country about education. But we are working on it. When I first left the University of Michigan as an economics graduate, then went to Teachers College, Columbia University, to work on school finance. Molly, when I was there, my master's thesis was on Robinson v. Cahill, right, the precursor to Abbott v. Burke, right? And then I went out to Denver to work at a place called the Education Commission of the States, and started working across the country on questions of equity and fairness, largely through school finance reform. You think back far enough, the education reform agenda of the country was really around equalizing resources. They were funding lawyers' committees across the country to pick fights with states who were slow to live up to their constitutional obligations to fund schools equitably. Linda Darling Hammond, way back then, was at the Rand Corporation with a fellow named Art Wise. They crafted the legal theory that the lawyers would then use to bring those cases up. And then, given the theater that litigation represented, if not the fact of strong, favorable decisions, there were a small group of us out at the Education Commission of the States. Our job was to sit there and wait for the states to ask for help. And most of them did at one time or another. And then a small group of us would be deployed to work with legislative committees and task forces to try and put better formulas in place. I could tell you stories, I won't, but I could tell you, I was in parts of the country where I shouldn't have been, probably, working on these things. Way back then, Jim, we used Fortran. That's how long ago this was, right? I literally would sit in the room with the staffers, and we would sit there and we would write code. And you'd sit there and you'd ask them, I need another $50 million to put into this formula. You give me, I can show you just how much more equity and fairness you could buy with that, right? Did that for a decade, and then moved to Indiana to work at the Lilly Endowment. The Lilly Endowment had more money than God. Prozac and Ceclor were at an all-time high in the market. I used to tell people, because we had our own cafeteria, and we would invite people in and to commiserate with them if we weren't going to give them money. And I would tell them, look, you know, I'm not a physician, but if you're that depressed, you're that depressed, it can only have an upward kick on our stock price, and we might eventually be that much more generous. But at that point, I started working on some of the other things that had to do with what happened for poor kids. Fast forward to my time in Washington. Now I'm actually funding the nation's research enterprise. 12 R&D centers, 10 regional labs, preside over the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and NCES, the keeper of all the data. And we're trying to keep this issue of what happens to poor kids on the nation's screen, trying to remind the Congress that the federal role in education was actually created around this issue. Now remember that, because when you look hard at the prevailing program strategies and grant competitions in DC this day, it would look remarkably more like a private foundation, than the federal government, I think. I left Washington and I went to work Senior Vice President for Children and Youth at Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, MDRC. What was that place? Invented during the War on Poverty by the Ford Foundation and what was then HEW, right? Bob Solos, the board chair, Julius Wilson, Mary Jo Bain, a stellar group of sociologists and economists who had spent 15 years doing randomized trials, social experiments, trying to build an information base on what lifted people out of poverty, right? Got themselves into education. Why? Because by this time they had 15 years of longitudinal data on very large federally funded interventions. And every time they didn't see the effect size they wanted to see, it took them back to education. So they asked me to come there and help them think through what would an education agenda look like for a place like that? What kinds of questions worked for the kind of research, signature research, that they did? So I went. The only regret I had, Jim, was that I hadn't given them enough money before I left the government. When I got there, I realized I needed a lot more money to do the kind of work that they did, but stayed there 3 or 4 years, peered into these longitudinal data sets. They had a project at the time called the Next Generation. And in a nutshell, what that project was, it was looking across all the data sets for 5, 6, 7, 8 big 5-year randomized trials. Income support, employment training, healthcare, childcare. And when you looked across the data about children across all those studies, what you found was that lifting people up out of poverty, if you could get them there, it had a huge positive net effect on the lives children led if you didn't do anything to the schools. So before you even got to an education effect, right? And then my wife said, Kent, I've appreciated this 7 to 10 year adventure you've been on in DC and in New York, but could you please come home? That's when I ended up in New Jersey. All right, that's when I ended up in New Jersey. And was only then that I submitted to actually being a dean. The last thing I wanted to do was be an academic. But I had to do something. And it was then that I ran for the school board in Morristown, actually. I think my wife was out in front of the school with a picket sign. Do not vote for him. He knows not what he's doing. Knows not what he's doing. But from there I came down south. And I'm getting ready to show you a set of slides that really opened my eyes in ways that they'd not previously been opened. But before I do that, let me just say one more thing. So I go down to the Southern Education Foundation, I look at these data, and by this time a curious thing had happened. Poverty had come off of the national agenda Low-income kids, poverty was not part of the narrative for what we needed to attend to in getting better social and academic outcomes for kids. And I looked around and I checked in with my new colleagues in philanthropy, trying to figure out what had happened. Here's what I think had happened. Number one, the big foundations had spent a lot of money over at least 15 years, and they didn't see the outcomes that they had hoped for. I remember even when I was at the Lilly Endowment, after 10 years, they shut the education program. You can blame me for this. Shut the education program down. Went to Pew, and 6 years later, Becky Reimel takes Pew out of K-12 education. And this was a pattern that repeated itself. Second thing that happened, a whole new generation of people show up in the offices of these foundations. They didn't go to school at Teachers College. They don't know who John Dewey is. They're coming out of MBA programs and the Kennedy School and business schools. They come to the work with a different set of metrics and theories of change, and they set up shop. And suddenly, ideas of competition and markets sound pretty attractive. And this market-based theory with accountability as the kind of headline starts to come into vogue. And lots of money reroutes into a whole new set of organizations and change theories in education. Now maybe this hasn't touched any of you. Maybe it hasn't had any impact on you at all. Right? But in Philly, in DC, in Chicago, in New Orleans, in LA, it has absolutely had a profound effect on the nature of the discourse and on the flow of resources and the ideas and theories about how you actually improve outcomes. And it was in this context that poverty, the argument was, is no excuse. Right? Is no excuse. So I've been grappling with that, roughing up my new colleagues in philanthropy. A few of them, I look at them and I wonder, Jim, I said, well, when I was 40-something, could I possibly have been like that? You know, was that me, is partly what I've been asking. It's not that these folks aren't well intended, I contend. It's that they don't know what they don't know. And unless or until they decide to put their own kids in our schools, will the real question about whether or not what's good for other people's kids good enough for them? We'll see. But what I am really here for is to get your advice about what I can take back to them. I have helped to form, I am a part of something called the New Models Funders Work Group that is trying to figure out, they're now suddenly worried about whether or not these reform ideas are actually going to do what they had hoped. So we're having a conversation about why do we have public schools in this country in the first place? Is it just about math and reading outcomes, or is it possibly something more than that? What role do public schools play in a modern democracy? Where do we help young people understand what this democracy is all about and teach them how to engage and participate in it? What would doing that mean for the roles that teachers play and the kind of culture and climate and curricula you would want to create and sustain in schools? And how would you measure whether any of that happened? Well, you get that from a $7 or $11 per kid standardized test. Or would we need to add other kinds of data and information into this story in order to really know? And do we think value-added assessments using standardized tests that weren't designed to make those kinds of decisions anyway is what's going to really generate information that moves our system forward in ways that advances the fortunes of the country? So that's what this small group of funders is grappling with. Now, they're funders, so they're scared to come and talk directly with you. That's why I'm here. You know, they're mostly comfortable talking to themselves. But that's why I'm here. I'm a little older than most of them, and I'm brave. So let me just say, when I'm done, I'm going to circle back to that question. I'm going to show you a couple of things that are on their mind. But the first thing I want to do is I want to tell you a story about this place I've moved to in the South. Let's see, Jim, if I can make this work. Whoops.
Why don't you just use this?
I'll just use this. Well, either one of them's gonna work.
There we go.
All right, good. Which one did you push? Okay, good. I'll do that.
Is that the first slide?
That's the first slide.
Okay.
Right, so this is the slide out of the new majority report that Jim was referring to. Southern Education Foundation hasn't so much been a grant-making engine, but a research operation, a think tank. And so every year or two, we go back and look at publicly available data and try to bring to the attention of the media and the policy community what patterns we see in the data. And what this is basically showing you, this is free and reduced lunch. That's the poverty measure we're working with. Wish we had something better, but this is what we have. And you can just sort of see right across the bottom of the country what has happened in terms of the makeup of the enrollment in public schools. Further south you go, the more concentrated that low-income enrollment turns out to be. Frankly, if the national average is approaching 50%, that ought to tell us something right there. I mean, this is indicative of the big gaps in income disparity, and inequality that is so evident here in the United States. No more evident than with looking at the kids. If you go to a measure of what we call extreme poverty, then you can see just how vivid that shows up for the American South. That's not really new. You think back to days when the federal government was mostly trying to equalize for differences in income and ability, they were sending more money to the South than anywhere else because that's where the population was poorest. But just take a look at that. We're talking about, in some instances, kids living in households, 3-4 kids in a household, $5-6 a day. There's a new study that talks about intergenerational mobility. And look, I was given a talk to the Population Roundtable on the Institute of Medicine about 4 weeks ago, and I walked through some of these slides. I decided not to say anything, just to click through them and let them take these data in. It's a very startling pattern by the time we get to the last one of these.
This says that if you're born in the deep southeast, and you're in the bottom quintile, your chances of making it into the top quintile as an adult are between 2.2 and 4.8%?
Yes, that's exactly what that's saying. So that's Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh. These are mostly city data. But though all of those southern towns are in the bottom decile in terms of the probability that you will actually move up out of it. Just startling.
Ken, how is that, what's that data based on? Is that like long range study and sort of watching what happens with school-age children as they progress through their high school, college years and beyond? I'm just wondering, how are those figures and how is all that data arrived at?
I will, when I'm done, I'll get you the actual study. So, because I can't speak to that with great clarity. But it's a set of folk at Harvard who have been pouring through population data, who built that particular map. Now, this is also, you can't see these numbers, they're too dark. But that's, Molly, that's per pupil spending. And so the very same geography where the kids are the poorest are the places that spend the least on the kids. So up here in the Northeast, 10, 12, $14,000 a kid. Mississippi, under 6. So half. And here's something interesting to us. At the same time that political environment is resistant to increasing support for public education, there's very aggressive activity in that same area to divert public resources to private education. Every one of these states has a tax credit scholarship, a voucher program, or both. We're in court right now in Georgia over a tax credit scholarship program that sends about $60 million a year to private schools. It was sold politically on the premise that it was to help low-income kids do what? Escape the public schools. But we can't find any low-income kids benefiting from this program. What we do find are a bunch of kids already enrolled in private schools, taking their kids over to the school district, enrolling them, and then taking them back out so they can qualify for this tax credit. So we're tracking this kind of activity across the country, but there's a lot of money in this if you add it up. Meanwhile, the school day, down from 185 days to 180, class size up from an average of 22 to 28, teachers still being furloughed, and compensation flat and declining in real terms. Now, the same part of the country with the highest teen birth rates, strong predictor of poverty, child poverty. Same part of the country with the highest rates of obesity in high school kids. I wasn't going to put this table in here because I can't explain it, I can't prove it. But it's the expectancy to live beyond age 65. It's lowest for that same part of the country. And of course we have the lowest high school completion rates. I should, Jim, have grabbed a couple of tables that are the extension of this in terms of college participation and post-secondary completion rates. We actually do have the data, but it would paint pretty much the same picture. Here are the TIMS data and how well kids in the South do on that international assessment. Some higher. But right here, this is what we call the Deep South, is where we do most of our work. So, we don't think, well, let me say two things about this. These are longitudinal, long-term NAEP scores. It would suggest that for a period of time, here's the school finance reform era, and a significant effort to try to equalize and pour new resources into the system. And you saw some gap closing. And here we are now with performance really having plateaued, and gaps being now rather stubborn. We don't think you can move those lines. These are national averages. We don't think you can move those lines if you can't change the numbers in the South. That's the argument I'm making to my friends in philanthropy, because all the money is up north. All the money is up north. And we can't get this done if we can't convince some of the money up north to come down south and work on this with us. But what we're telling them is that you can't move those lines. There are not enough kids of color in the rest of the country to move those lines. If you can't turn this around in the American South, not gonna get it done nationally. It's just not, it can't happen. So let me go back to my friends in philanthropy. Because they're now some of them. I'm not talking about Bill Gates. I'm not talking about Eli Broad. And I'm certainly not talking about the Waltons. But Ford, Carnegie, Knight, MacArthur, Hewlett, Helmsley, and some new ones are starting to worry about whether or not we have an education system in this country that can turn these lines, the slope of these lines, up and shift the distribution of achievement up into the right. They don't think we do. They would argue the system you guys mostly run was invented 60, 70 years ago. The way we think about the school calendar, the way we think about the school year, the way we think about curriculum, the way we think about teaching and learning and assessment, largely unchanged over that entire period of time. And that if it doesn't change, you're not going to move those lines. That's what they're talking about. Met with them 3 weeks ago in D.C. for 2 days. And so they think you can find schools all over the place that have figured some of this out, but they're understood to be the exception, not the rule. They don't think school systems are set up to get a better outcome at scale. That's what they think. And they're actually spending a lot of money now trying to think through the communications and messaging strategies for how they would change the discourse. I told them they need to spend more money with the educators in the schools rather just on messaging strategy. But they are enamored with a group out at Stanford called the Frameworks Institute, which does a lot of polling and focus groups in all of your communities, talking about schools with parents and citizens. And so they think that the system isn't set up. It doesn't value what it needs to value. So here's what they've come up with. This is Common Core for everyone, I suppose. But a system that's student-centered, where equity is sort of like the main thing people are focused on. Now, you're not going to tell me you guys aren't focused on equity. And democracy and judgment and responsibility. Here they're talking about teachers. And then there's a whole set of things that they have come up with to elaborate these values in terms of policy. And they would argue, they're arguing, that right now the system is not focused on these things, especially the market-based reformers. The whole child, not just the cognitive or academic part. So this has to do with focusing on the health determinants of education. If you can't see, if you got asthma, if you got dental problems, if you've got anxiety because you live in neighborhoods where you can't walk to school, how are you going to be ready to learn? Different kinds of assessments, not designed just to tell you who had an uptick at the margin on a standardized test, but formative information. That's what they mean by this. They want to move from the Carnegie unit or seat time to something based on competency. And they want to get away from these value-added teacher assessments to more authentic measures of good teaching. They want to redesign school improvement and accountability so that it is geared toward measuring 1, 2, 3, and 4. Obviously, they want to put more resources into the system, and they think we need another generation of school finance formulas that actually would do that. They have a big issue, this is Ford's issue in particular, about time. They don't see how you could get those numbers to change for kids that are poor in 185 days. Just don't, you can't get there from here. So they would take umbrage with the traditional school calendar and the school day. And they think we've underutilized technology dramatically. And they don't think this system is actually driven by research and evidence in the ways that it should be. I'm just telling you, they spent a year just doing that. I don't think it needed to take them that long. But like I said, they weren't talking to anybody but themselves. But now they're trying to figure out, A, is this list of policy ideas, is it on target? Is it new? Like they think it's new. I'm not sure it is. Is it even new? And the big question is, how are these ideas lifted up and advanced in the public discourse in this country about public education? That's the elephant in the room. They're trying to figure out how to get these kind of things talked about. And actually, some of them wonder, where are the education leaders? Where is their voice with respect to these things? That's kind of what they're curious about. And you guys could have a lot of advice for me on that one, I think. What happens when you talk about things in these ways in your own communities and districts? Does this stuff make sense to your school boards and your parents or not? I need to know. I need to go back and tell these folks, look, this is old news. This is old news. But then I need to tell them, what should they be doing? What should they be talking about? And how could they put their philanthropic resources to good use in helping to create the enabling conditions for a healthier public education enterprise? Because the one impulse I think they've finally gotten right is that spending 15 years with a negative narrative about public education makes it awfully hard to turn around and make arguments about the need to value it and invest in it. So they've helped to create this problem. They've helped to create this problem. They created it by not being able to look far enough back in the data to see what kind of progress the system has actually made. On that point, people like Diane Ravitch, who've been through some kind of a cathartic moment, she's kind of right? David Ballina was always right. I mean, so there are people who know these things, but they don't have the public's ear. One last thing, then I'll pause, Jim, that the philanthropic community is struggling with is this. It is very easy in this country for us to get into a kind of either or kind of discourse. So let me go there for just a second. The far right is very well organized. They're very disciplined. They've got resources, a simple narrative, right? Choice is a really simple narrative. Relating whether a teacher's any good to the test score, a very simple and compelling narrative, right? And very disciplined about that. Last year, when we spent a little bit of money, what little bit of money we had, trying to beat back on an attempt to amend the Constitution in Georgia, which we lost, to create a separate state agency to issue charters. The truth of the matter is, those simple and compelling narratives were appealing, even to the families and households who had the most to lose by voting for it. Where did the money come from to run the campaign? $1 million buys up about as much TV time as you need for an issue like this. Most of it wasn't even from inside Georgia. It was from the charter management organizations that were looking to do what? Siphon off a chunk of public funds. So they've been at this for 20 years. Meanwhile, what do? The research community argues in public about small things, makes it look like we don't know anything at all. And us educators do what we are asked to do, even if we've been set up to fail. Even if we've been set up to fail. We implement NCLB because they told us to. Now we're doing the same thing with the Common Core. Tell me how 4 kids are going to learn the Common Core in 180 days with the resources that are in the system that are there, with the accountability apparatus that's operating. I don't see how that happens. But I can't find a national organization or a chief state school officer that isn't just sort of focused on it. So where is that educator voice about what we should actually be talking about and what we should actually be doing? I think they're looking for it. I think they're looking for it and trying to figure out how to leverage it. They think you guys are perfectly happy the way things are. Honestly, when I tell you this, that's what they think. So that's my story about the South. I think tomorrow you're going to see a whole lot more data about what's really going on economically and demographically in the country. It's going to make a lot of sense to you because you know that housing and transportation policy and a bunch of other things really explain these swings in income disparity and opportunity. But the conversation about the implications of that for our public education system and what it needs, that's the conversation that is missing. I wrote an op-ed piece for Philanthropy Digest about a month ago in which I said it's time to put poverty back on the table, right? And I'm looking down, you're supposed to get these comments, you know, at the bottom, right? Right? You're supposed to get all this commentary, right? Man, I couldn't even piss anybody off. I couldn't even get a negative comment, right? Couldn't even get a negative comment. Man, but it's still there. it's still up. And I'm holding out some hope. But last point. I think I've got Carnegie and Ford and a couple of others, Mary Reynolds Babcock, willing to join me in the South to create something called the Forum on Education in the Future of the South. And what that will be, if they help me with it will be about discourse. It will be putting educators, teachers, parents, activists, people from Southern philanthropy in a conversation about the role that public schools play in a modern democracy and economy. And we're going to show them all these data. And here's the thing we're trying to do. We're going to replace this narrative about what we're against with the conversation about what we're for. We pulled a bunch of people together about 10 months ago. Molly, were you there for part of it with that meeting in September? Yeah. And the hardest thing for us to do was to talk about what we were for. It is so easy to disagree and run to the ends of the spectrum. But try to get some people in the room and actually talk about what we all agree we're for. It's a much harder thing. But that's what we're going to try to do. And if we have any luck with it, we hope that catches on, Jim, way more than the new majority report, because that's what we think the country needs to learn how to do. Is talk about the things that we're for. And the country's got to focus on its kids. You know, at the end of it's a hard movie to watch right now in the South with those regressive politics. But Georgia was 300,000 votes away from going from red to blue. If you just got the 200,000 formerly incarcerated people registered to vote, you chipped away at 2/3 of that problem, right? And you'd be surprised how close the math is in that new, diverse majority. There's a reason why you have all those voter laws being passed. Because those folks can count. They know what's eventually happening. They know. But those kids need to be smart. They need to care about the country. They need to appreciate why it's important to be a part of the community. They've got to appreciate diversity and other people's cultures. And that's what our schools do. That's what our schools do. And we have to remind the non-educators about that. We just have to. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate your time.
So I'm hoping that you all have lots of advice for Kent, and that Kent's going to stand up here like a man and take it. While you're thinking about the advice that you would like to offer to the foundations, I've got a couple of things that I think you might want to bring over to them. And one of them is to fight back against this attitude that educators are happy with the situation, that we are comfortable with the sorts of achievement levels that we see in particularly low-income and minority communities. let's face it, nobody cares more about kids than people who devoted their lives to these children, standing in front of them and dealing with their families. And the idea that foundation officials paying themselves in multiples of 6 figures care more about these low-income children than people in this room, it just doesn't pass the smile test as far as I'm concerned. Nor are we happy with the policies. I mean, as you've said, we've marched out like loyal soldiers because by and large we tend to follow directions, and we implemented policies under No Child Left Behind and also under Race to the Top that anyone who took 5 minutes looking at that legislation 10 years ago knew right then was destined to be a failure. And in fact, the people who enacted that legislation knew that it was pie in the sky and fanciful, and that it had never been accomplished anywhere in the world, and it was unlikely to be accomplished here. So I feel very strongly about that. So that's a message I want you to bring back to your colleagues in the foundation community. Also, I would hope you would emphasize what you stressed was the insight you got from the MDRC work. That if you took families out of poverty, it had a remarkable effect on student achievement, even if you did nothing else in the schools. I mean, that's a very powerful message that they need to hear. And I think it bears repeating in that respect that you need to remind them that 20 to 30% of achievement differences are related to in-school effects. 70 to 80% are related to out-of-school effects. And I don't know that anyone really is going to argue with this. I mean, maybe it's not new, but they all look like perfectly sensible policies. But if 80% of the problem is outside the school, we're not going to solve it by directing 90% of our attention to what's going on inside the school. And I think that's what's happening with this. So I would hope that the foundations would urge the federal government to worry about equity in schools and in the larger society, because that's what the federal government and state government should be worrying about, and that the foundations would go back to their traditional and much more modest role of experimenting and trying to find things that worked and trying to find things that were promising, instead of trying to outline outcomes and specify the outcomes. Because the fact of the matter is that no matter how much the foundations put into all of this, they're just a leaf on the river of school finance, and you've got to get that river rerouted in order to have the sort of effects that we want. These figures that you put up here about the levels of poverty, of concentrated poverty, of deep poverty in the South, the lack of funding in the South, combined with your insight that there aren't enough minority students outside the South to change that pattern. These are very compelling insights, and the foundation community, and I hope the government needs to pay attention to it. So I'm going to get off my soapbox because I know there's a lot of other advice coming to you from the room here.
I represent a small urban district, 4,800 kids in Pennsylvania, so I'm a northern person. And I am concerned about your thoughts about ignoring what's going on in the north because our numbers of students who are impoverished are small compared with the south. Because of the inequity in the north, in my district, for example, I'm 83% low income, and I'm 11th from the bottom in the state for funding. Doesn't make any sense. So places in the north are ignoring poverty. It's isolated, they don't have to deal with it. And if they don't deal with it there, I don't think they're going to listen to what's going on in the south either. So I think that whole equity thing has to be pushed everywhere.
I wouldn't argue that. I wouldn't argue that.
Used to represent a district with high migrant poverty. And you were talking about coming to school with cavities,
Yeah.
major dental work.
Yeah.
How are you going to do that? One of the things that I think we miss with the Affordable Care Act, children insurance is really dirt cheap. The federal government could guarantee to every child in this country a medical program that would solve a lot of those problems for those kids.
So, great point. In 2 weeks, I'll be back in Chicago, giving a speech to a group of folks assembled by something called the Healthy Schools Campaign. 3 weeks ago, I was at the National Academies of Sciences with a slightly different set of slides like this. At the Population Roundtable, mostly a set of medical folk around that table. Here's the issue. I walk into that room, and what are they focused on? They're focused on how to get better health outcomes. And they're looking at lots of population data that tells them that the better educated someone is, the more likely is that their health outcomes go up. And I went in and said, you need to flip that upside down. And so we talked about that. But this is another example of the fragmentation in the country. They can't figure out how to access you. We speak in different languages, we got different accountability systems, and there needs to be a conversation between the education community, the education system, and the health system about how to make exactly what you said happen. They know that they could get kids signed up. They know there's money in the Affordable Care Act to resource screening and prevention and a whole bunch of things like that. But we've got to figure out a way to actually have those conversations across systems to work through that. 2 days later, I'm at the White House in a conversation about issues of substance abuse and the same set of issues. So that's another thing in terms of we're so much in our silos that it's hard to work across. There's some big changes occurring in the healthcare system. My wife's a pediatrician, and she should be, the incentive should be to have her spending a lot more time interacting with schools. But I guarantee you, if she doesn't see 30 patients a day, or she's not going to be in business. So the incentives aren't for her to spend any time in school. The incentives run for her to spend exactly 15 minutes with each patient from 8:30 in the morning to 5:30 in the afternoon. Now, as the system flips from paying people to see people to rewarding people for folks being healthy and prevention, it changes the role of that pediatrician, and it flips the logic of what the healthcare system's trying to do. At that same meeting I was at the Research Council, an economist came in and explained, this is of some interest, Molly, how much state aid is being sucked away from education by the pressure from Medicaid, right? And so we're busy arguing about how to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, but if you could actually get a healthcare system that worked in the country and focused on prevention, that deficit would come down, and suddenly the resources that used to come to public schools and higher ed might actually be there. So we got a lot of things at the system and policy level that aren't working very well in this country. I mean, your point's very well taken. And the good news is the health folk are dying to talk with us about it.
I think that we'll all agree there's no silver bullet in this. New Jersey has probably been different than most states with the Abbott decision that was referenced a little bit earlier. And being what is now formally known as an Abbott district, learned two things. One, money doesn't solve all the problems, but I also know that lack of money doesn't solve any problem either.
Right.
But as we start to go through this and some of what we're looking at, some simple things that take place, eyeglasses, you know, just bringing in the mobile van for eyeglasses,
Yeah.
very cheap thing to do. We found that 20% of our sixth graders needed glasses. and we had a couple of charitable organizations in town, took care of it. I can't quantify that one, but I know that there are a bunch of kids that see better today than they did the day before. When we start integrating some different services, and that's probably the biggest problem we have, is we're not bringing people to the table at the local level that need to really be engaged in this conversation. So it's almost as though we need a model that says, okay, from a community point of view, if you're not talking to this one, this one, this one, and this one, start getting them at the table. Once you do that, you can move on to some bigger initiatives, going right to what was discussed moments ago. But we're not doing that locally, and we're trying to bubble it up to the state and federal level, and it's a lot easier to say they should do X, Y, and Z. Really, there's probably a lot more potential that we have at our desk.
You know, I'm a big fan of asking for forgiveness, you know, rather than permission. I do think, to your point, we're at a moment in the life of the country where the solutions, the best ones, are going to be very local, and that at the local level, the best shot at blurring these partisan lines, because, you know, the challenges and opportunities are right in front of you. And it may well be that folks at the state and especially at the federal level will be watching rather than following, rather than leading. Jerry?
Kent, with your work with the foundations, have you thought about the possibility of using some of that funding to do what has been brought up here, to help coordinate the efforts of the different silos so that they start to talk to each other, not only at a policy level but also at local level, and to try to also unify the messages that would be politically viable to counteract the super organized, simplistic messages of the right.
Right. Well, I think to the latter point, that question of how to craft a unifying message, people are working on that. They see it, Jerry, as a kind of problem that fits with the resources that are available to them, right?
Good.
And so I do think there's going to be some serious work on that right now. The motivation for this initially was actually to try to have some influence on the next presidential cycle. I think some of the folks in the group are less sure if that's A, possible, or B, important. But
It is.
but that's still on the table. But the message side, I think, is going to get worked on, and that's why this question of values. The question is, at what level could you get people from different places, sitting in wearing different hats, to actually agree? We must be getting close to dinner time, because you moved closer to me. you moved closer to me.
I did.
But on the first point, let me just finish. On the first part, that is what we're going to try to do, is have these conversations across sector. And I think in the short run, the trick is just to see what happens when you get these folk from, you know, very different planets in the same room. And we're going to have to work a lot on language and vocabulary. We had a meeting 3 months ago just in the early childhood space, and just trying to compare the data systems, how people think about what an issue is. So I think that's going to be what I'm saying to Carnegie and Ford is, this is a 5-year effort. This is not an event, but this is a conversation that's going to have to take a while to actually happen. But I think it needs to. Good question.
Let's take one more question and understand that you are the only thing standing between us and the bar back there. So one more question. Rich?
I think what kind of gives me hope is there are organizations like Communities in Schools, you know, which is serving over 1 million kids
Yeah.
in school districts around the country right now, and you know, tons of school districts. And you know, that's a local partnership that brings together business leaders with educators, philanthropists, leaders in social service agencies, and the whole focus is how can we bring in the resources, the support that kids need in schools in order to succeed. So I mean, Jim is absolutely right. And we have the outside of school life of kids and we have the inside of school life. It seems to me that, you know, the challenge is how can we bring these together, and how can we bring together communities to help provide our kids in school with the support, the services, the health care, the social service support, whatever that it takes for kids, particularly disadvantaged kids, in order to succeed. But, you know, the hope is there's working models out there that we can build on, and groups like yours can build on.
And I think that's exactly right. Here's the one thing I hope doesn't happen. And it's that we take that as the new normal and never return to the question of how much money needs to be in the system. Right? I mean, people spend different amount of money for a reason. They wouldn't spend $18,000 a kid in Lower Merion.
27.
27. If they didn't think they were getting something for it. Right? So I think all of that stuff matters. But the idea that it ought to supplant or replace the responsibility for the system to resource things adequately, I think that's what we've watched over the last 20 years, is the systematic dismantling of a social welfare system that used to provide income supports to children and families. So we're getting exactly what we apparently asked for in this country. And this dark narrative where back when the war on poverty started, this was a country that thought the government could do things. There was a certain kind of ambition in the country, right? And we had won, or at least fought, a couple of world wars. We went through a Cold War, and then we had a post-war dividend. And what we do with it? We created the GI Bill. We sent a bunch of people on to college. We fueled an industrial revolution, and then we said, well, let's just take on poverty too. Now the country is in a very different place. So the very thing I'm talking about is that much harder. It's a function of will, way more than it's a function of knowledge and understanding about what to do. And I think that's what the funders are at root grappling with, is how do we build that political will back up. But it will help to have a few educators saying, this is what we need to do. Thanks a lot.
So I want to thank Kent for getting us off to just a fabulous start. And my message to the foundations that they should push is that old message from the oil change guy. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. And a remarkable study came out of ETS last year showing that the costs of our ignoring child poverty amount in this country to $500 billion annually. So every 2 years, we're pouring $1 trillion down the drain because we're not dealing with this issue. So you can pay me now or you can pay me later. Let me just finish up by saying, if you want to alert people to what's going on here and to the fact that they can access these fabulous presentations, that's the hashtag NSR Chicago14. Twitter that out. And that's the address of the, you're going to have to walk up and look at that one. That's the address of the video stream. We are adjourned for the evening and we'll reconvene in the back of the room. Thank you very much, Ken.
The whole with these critical component reactors.